Good morning. All right, John chapter 9. If you want to follow along in the text, John chapter 9. My grandfather and grandmother on my dad's side lived in a place called Dewdrop, Tennessee. Now, there wasn't much in Dewdrop. Dewdrop was close to Lanes Ferry, and there's not much in Lanes Ferry, where there obviously used to be a ferry, I guess, but the time I got there, there was a bridge. So, Dewdrop had a tavern. That's about the only thing that it had at Dewdrop, but they lived in a house at Dewdrop, and you probably can't even find it on a map if you Google it. If you really want to know where it is, you come see me, and I get on the Google map, and I'll show you where it is. When I would go visit them, when they first moved into this house, and I would go sometimes and spend like a week or so, like you know, I don't know if y'all do this now anymore. The boys used to do it with their grandparents. During the summer, you go spend a week with your grandparents, or maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks, however long they let you stay. And so when I went to, they were called Mamaw and Papaw. Okay, so when I went to Mamaw and Papaw's house, at the end of the hallway, at the back of the house on the left, that's where I stayed when I was at that house, in that back left-hand bedroom. I don't remember if they had, I'm sure they had lights in the house, but I do remember this. They had an outhouse. There was no indoor restroom. In Hornbeak, where I slept in my bedroom, I rolled out of the bed on the same side every day, because that's the way my bed was faced. At Mamaw and Papaw's house, if you rolled out of the bed that way, you hit a wall. And I can remember waking up in the middle of the night with no lights anywhere around, rolling over, hitting that wall, and thinking, where am I? Because I can't be at my house, because that's the way I get out of bed, and now there's a wall there. And in my little mind back in those days, my mind could not process where I was, so I remember I would feel around the edge of the wall trying to figure out where I am. Now, there's another thing you need to know about this little bedroom that is at the back of the house on the left side. There's this big tree that was on that side of the house, and that tree was a snake den. It was full of chicken snakes. And sometimes they would get in the house. But I would feel around that wall trying to figure out where I was in the pitch black, not knowing where I was or where I was going. And then I remember as a kid, anybody been to the cave when you were a kid, and they take you down in the cave and they turn the lights out, and you put your hand in front of your face, and you cannot, it is so dark, you cannot see your hand. And I'm not, just so you know, I'm not a great fan of that. I'm not a great fan at all. I went spelunking with this friend of mine in college. So he wanted to go. I didn't even know. I was from West Tennessee, man. We didn't have caves. I didn't know what spelunking was. Oh, let's go to my house and go spelunking. I'm like, cool, man. And so we go down to Georgia to go spelunking. And I remember we're down in the cave and the flashlight went out. And I thought, okay, I'm not a fan of this. I'm not a fan of this. I'm not a fan of that kind of darkness. And I wonder about John chapter 9 with the man who was born blind and the darkness that he lived in. And I think there's a great spiritual parallel between his darkness and his spirit and his blindness and spiritual blindness that occurs in our world today. But in John chapter 9, Jesus, as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. And I think I'm so much like the disciples. Because when the disciples saw the man who was blind from birth, their first question was, Rabbi, who sinned? This man or his parents that he was born blind? Now, don't be too difficult on the disciples. They were kind of following, okay. That's not working, so Reggie will get me to the right slide. They were kind of following some of the thought process of their day, because this was some of the thought process of their day. Those who were kind of Greek and Roman and from a very pagan type background had this concept of reincarnation. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail about that, but this is kind of the way the reincarnation thought process worked. Whatever you do in this life, you're going to be reincarnated into a different form in the next life. So you're going to come back into the world as something, and our world has this idea of reincarnation in some ways as well, but it's kind of a thought process for them. And here's how it would work. If you did really good in this life, when you come back in the next life, you'll come back blessed with a lot of money and riches. And if you did bad things in the life before, that when you come back into this life, you'll come back poor and as a servant, and you'll come back to a miserable type of life instead of a good type of life. The rabbis who were Jewish rejected that, of course, because that doesn't have any Old Testament thought process. So they had this idea, which was the law, kind of a law of retribution that they pulled out from Exodus, and that is that the sins of the parents go to the third and the fourth generation. So that if something happens to you, if you're born in a bad situation or something happens to you in your birth, that it was because of the sin of your parents. Your parents did something that caused a sin, and then that's what happened to you. Now, some of those rabbis went kind of to another step. I don't know if I put this on there or not, but it was kind of another step, which was, let me skip that. We already talked about that. They had this thought process that you could also kind of sin in the womb. And let me give you an example. Jacob and Esau. In some of the rabbinical writings, so Jacob and Esau would struggle while they were in the womb. That's where all the struggle came from. So if they went by a holy place, Jacob would struggle to get out, and if they went by an unholy place, then Esau would struggle to get out. And the reason that they were tumbling in the womb is that Esau was trying to kill Jacob, so he sinned in the womb. Now again, no scriptural basis for that at all, okay? So hang on to that. But for the disciples who would hear all of this debate about the problem of evil in the world, they're looking at that and they see this man who is sitting there and he's born blind, and in their theological discussion, they're wanting Jesus to comment. Okay, Jesus, who's right? Who sinned? Did he sin in the womb, or was the reincarnation thing right, or did his parents sin so that he was born blind? Who's at fault for this to happen? And mankind has struggled with that question since the very beginning. And if you're looking for me to give you an answer to it, I'm just going to tell you I'm not smart enough. I'm not smart enough. Jesus says neither this man nor his parents sinned that he was born blind, but that the glory of God might be displayed in his life. And when I look into my world and I see injustices, I mean, honestly, sometimes I'm faced with the very same questions. Why do injustices occur? Have you ever thought about what would have happened if you were born into a different family at a different time? What if instead of being born to Larry and Wilma Smith in Hornbeak, Tennessee, who were such really good parents, I know they'll listen to this, but they have really good parents, who took me to church and instilled faith in Jesus in me and helped me see life from a realistic point of view. And I'm extremely, extremely thankful to them for that. But what if I had been born to another set of parents in another place in another time? How different might I have been? How different would I be? And we struggle with the injustices in the world when we see our injustices. And if we're honest and we look at the world, we do see injustices in our world. I mean, it's okay for us to stand here and say, we struggle with why some people are born with unhealthy bodies, or why some people are born with abnormalities, or why somebody is born into a certain place in the world where just the struggle to live and the struggle to survive. And I tell you, I struggle with that. And the Jewish rabbis, they had this direct cause and relationship between sin and suffering. And it goes, way back, even to the time of Job. Y'all remember the story of Job, right? And when all the bad things happened to Job and the three friends showed up, this is kind of a Greg Smith paraphrase, but and you can answer it, what did they ask? Anybody remember? What did you do wrong? You had to do something wrong for this to happen, and they have this direct cause and relationship between sin and suffering, and we have to be really careful, because when something happens in our life, sometimes we say, oh man, what did I do wrong? Or what did they do wrong? Or it's got to be, if something bad happens, it's got to be a punishment for something, and that's where the disciples are, and you can't always figure that out, and it's not always that way, is it? It's not always that way. The struggle I have with the disciples is the same one that I have with me. The blind man became a theological question for the disciples when they should have recognized his need and responded to it. And sometimes we look in our world and we're debating all these theological questions. Why does this happen and why does that happen? And we don't, and God is marvelous, okay? And I don't understand all the ways that God works in this world. I never will understand all the way God worked in this world because God is mysterious. And I can't, if I could figure God out, God wouldn't be God. Because I'm human and He's not. But I look into my world and so many times I start with all the theological questions, but I miss what Jesus is going to do here because I don't recognize the need of people. I'm trying to figure out something theologically. What if instead of trying to figure out theological questions, we just looked into the world and we saw somebody like the blind man and we said, I wonder how he needs help. What can I do? How can I help him? I mean, wouldn't it have been great if the disciples said, hey, Jesus, how can we help this man who was born blind? And he's blind from birth. But it's a question that his society would have been asking. He's not an object of mercy to them. He's a theological question. Now, let's be honest. Did his parents sin? The man born blind? Oh yeah, they did. How do I know that? Don't know anything about them. How do I know they were sinners? They're human. Yeah, there you go. We all are, right? They were human. Did the man who was born blind, did at some point in his life he sin? Yeah, he did. I don't know what he did. Don't know what it was. But he did because he's human. And Jesus isn't saying, oh no, there's no sin in the world, but it wasn't a cause and effect relationship that he's talking about here. So Jesus shows up on the scene, and instead of debating this big theological question, this is what Jesus says. He says, well, I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world. And Jesus came to bring healing to this individual and not judgment. I think that's really important. I want you to hang on to that. Jesus didn't bring judgment, He brought healing. So Jesus shows up. So I skipped through all those slides. I should have. And Jesus gives him this instruction. He spits on the ground and he makes this mud. He puts the mud on the man's eyes and he says, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and he washed and he came home seeing. You ever thought about that? I mean, just think about that. How long has this man been blind? Since birth. Since birth. Do people know who he is? Oh yeah. Yeah, blind since birth. A man shows up. He makes mud, he puts it on your eyes and says, go wash, and you go wash. Does that amaze you? I'm just telling you up front, that amazes me that he just followed the instruction. You know, he probably thought, well, maybe there's some water who's closer than that. Or why don't I just, wipe the mud off here? Why do I have to go there and wash? When you look at it, the thing that's amazing about me, the blind man followed Jesus' instruction. I got to tell you a story. I have a good friend. His name's Fred. And I met Fred when I preached at Cheap Hill, and maybe he'll watch this, but Fred and I would have this ongoing discussion about baptism. And Fred's a lawyer, and he's really intellectual and a really good thinker. And he would say, well, how about baptism? And he'd ask me a question. And I would give him an answer. And we kayaked and fished a lot then, and it might be a couple of months later, he would ask me another question, and so sometimes there were months between questions and answers and the next question. I mean, this is this conversation over years. One day we're paddling down Harpeth River and we're fishing, and we're not catching anything, by the way. And Fred's behind me in the canoe, and he says, hey, I figured it out. And I said, you figured what out? He said, I figured baptism out. I said, really? I said, what's the answer? He said, just because God said do it. Yes. Yes. That's it. It's following Jesus' instruction. I mean, when you think about it, just put your intellectual brain to work for a second. So, dipping you in a pool of water, it doesn't have to be this pool, right? It can be any pool anywhere. But dipping you in a pool of water is God's way of working with you spiritually to remove your sin, to make you holy. Does that make sense? I know what's death, burial, and resurrection. Yeah, just think about it. Could God have chose something else? Yes, he could have. About 2/3 of the water, 2/3 of the world is water, so I think it's why he picked water, because it's usually around. But the point is, does it always make intellectual sense, the way God works in the world? No. And so he comes to the blind man and says, I just want you to go wash. So the man goes and he does exactly what Jesus says. He comes back and he can see. And all of a sudden you've got this man who's been blind since birth, and now he can see. And people are amazed. Y'all can read this later. I'm just giving you the Greg Smith paraphrase, all right? They see the man and they say, hey, that looks like the guy who used to be blind and he begged. And some people say, oh, yeah, that's him. That's him. That's the guy. And then some, probably more like me, would have said, well, that's not the guy. He just looks like the guy, right? Because that guy was blind and this guy can see. So, it's not really him, just kind of looks like him. And so the crowd, the people who have seen him around, they're debating, is that really the guy or not? I mean, you can imagine what that would be like for us, right? I mean, imagine we knew somebody who was blind from birth, and we show up on Sunday and they can see, and we would be debating, oh, is that the same guy or is that a different guy? And the man who was born blind said, hey, it's the Greg Smith paraphrase, all right? It's me. Hey, I'm the guy. I'm the guy. Well, what happened? Well, I don't know. This guy told me Now, just think outside the box a minute. Did he know what Jesus looked like? Oh, he was blind, right? So Jesus shows up, he puts mud, he goes and washes, and now he can see, and they show up, and they're saying, oh, who told you to do that? What does he say? Well, I didn't see him, right? And they start this process, and they start interrogating him, and they start asking him. He said, but he does know this. It was that man called Jesus. He don't know what Jesus looks like, but he knows it's Jesus. So he says, well, that man Jesus told me to go do this, and I went and do that, and now I can see. Now, when Jesus does that, this is the Sabbath. Okay, what do the Pharisees get really upset about? You don't need to heal anybody on the Sabbath, right? And Jesus made him see. And he is like loudly proclaiming that to everybody who asks. They lead him to the Pharisees. We're going to look at that in just a minute. And he loudly proclaims it. He says, this is what Jesus has done for me. And they say, well, no, he did it on the Sabbath. He can't be a man from God. Well, he must be a man from God because he made me see. And it's funny when you start just reading that with some humor, and finally he just gets to the point. He says, well, if he's a prophet or not, I don't know, but I do know this. I couldn't see, and now I can. What did Jesus do for you? I mean, what has he done for you? I mean, you can start, well, I'm going to list all of these different things, and honestly, I just want you to think about one. He took you from being spiritual blind to where you can see. He forgave your sin. All of it. I mean, just think about that for a second. He forgave your sin. All of it. No matter what you have done, no matter where you are in life, and if you haven't done that yet, can he do that? Can Jesus, in the power that God gave him, forgive your sin? To make you completely whole, spiritually healthy in a moment. Because he's the Son of God. He has the ability to do that. And if somebody came and asked us, would we be kind of like the blind man? Would we be willing to say, let me tell you what Jesus did for me? I've told this story before, but it's important for this one. Years ago, I got asked to go to a Tres Dias, which was it's kind of a spiritual weekend. And I went, and since I'm a preacher, to go back, you have to be a spiritual director. So they asked me to go back as a spiritual director. And I did. I was happy to serve. And the spiritual director always had to give a talk. So they assigned me a talk. Charles Moffett was there. He can relate to this. During the talk, part of the talk is you have to give your story. And you have to tell who you were and where you came from and how you found Jesus. And I'm going to be very honest with you. most of the guys who were giving those spiritual talks at Trace Diaz came from a background that was far, far different than mine. They had stories about drug abuse, or being in jail, or being abusive to their wives. And they had these stories. I didn't have a story like that. And so when it got time for me to share my story, I was like, what am I supposed to say? What am I supposed to say about my story? So I did the only thing I knew to do. I got up and I was as truthful as I possibly could. And I remember how I started that off. I said, I want you guys to know that I don't have a story like most of you guys have a story. I don't have parents who were abusive to me. I had parents who loved me tremendously. I never doubted if my parents loved me. I had parents who instilled faith in Jesus in me. And I have parents who were supportive. And I have parents who helped me through life. And you know, I talked about, you know, I married a young lady who has been supportive and loving, and you know, we have a great marriage, and our marriage isn't falling apart. And you know, I talked about, you know, I don't have kids who have caused me tons and tons of problems. You know, they're boys, but they've been, you know, generally they've been good boys. And you know, we went through the whole process, and I'm thinking this is not going to register with any of the guys who are listening to this story, because it's not the story they're used to listening to. And it almost brought me to tears at the end, because there was this long line of guys who wanted to say something to me. And this is what they said. Thank you for sharing that, because we didn't know families like that still existed. And I was like, well, they do, and you can have one. You can have one. And so many times we look at things and we think, okay, what has Jesus done for us? And we forget we are all sinners. And God has blessed our lives spiritually in remarkable ways. He's done something far greater than restoring our physical sight. He has given us spiritual hope and forgiveness. And I mean, just, are you willing just to shout out what Jesus has done for you? And so all of these people show up to start questioning the blind man. So the Pharisees will tell us exactly what happened, because this was on the Sabbath. It's Greg Smith paraphrase again. Okay, y'all can go back to read the text. Y'all read John later. And he said, well, I don't know. This man showed up. He made mud, told me to go to wash. He went and washed, and I could see. Well, how did he do it? Well, I don't know. He told me to go wash, and so they questioned him. And they think, well, we don't really believe him. So you remember the story? They call in his parents, right? And they call in his parents and say, now look, is this guy really born blind? Is he really your son? And I'm like, yeah, he's our son. And he was born blind. Well, how come he can see? Well, we don't know why he can see. You'll have to ask him. I mean, he's old enough for you to ask him those questions. And they're afraid. There's a fear of the Jews, because the Jews are casting out of the synagogue people who believe in Jesus. So they're afraid to speak out. So they bring the man back in again and say, now tell us again what happened. He said, well, I've already told you once. And you want to hear it again? I mean, he told me to wash, and I washed, and now I can see. Well, he can't be a man from God because he did it on the Sabbath. The guy says, I don't know if he's a man from God or not. I know he told me to wash, now I can see, so it sounds like a man from God to me. And so they start to ask, and he said, well, do y'all want to be disciples too? Well, it infuriates them, right? You're his disciple. Do you remember what they say? This is so great in the text. They're investigating the hearing and investigating what happens. And he replied, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I know is I was blind and now I see. And they ask him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And I love this. He answered, I told you already, and you didn't listen. Do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? Then they hurled insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. And the man answered, that's remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to a godly person who does his will. And nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And they replied, you are steeped with sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. Wow. Wow. Let me just think about that for a second. Did the blind man ever back down? Never backed down. You know, the best thing that could happen to the blind man was that they cast him out, because they cast him out and Jesus takes him in, right? And that's the best thing that can happen to you. When Jesus heard that they'd thrown him out and he found him and he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And I love the man. He said, "Well, who is he? Tell me so that I can believe in him." And Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." And the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. Who do you worship? God. What did the man who was born blind know that the Pharisees who could see not know? That Jesus is the Son of God. "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." And the Pharisees who were with him heard him say this, and they asked, "What, are we blind too?" And Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." A man born blind. To anybody who's blind, I don't mean physically, spiritually. They just can't see. They just haven't found the truth that is in Jesus. It seems that spiritual concepts and spiritual things just somehow seem to escape them. They just don't seem able to grasp it. It's not that they were necessarily born that way, but maybe they grew up in a household or a circumstance where they have not been exposed to spiritual truth the way that you've been exposed to spiritual truth. Maybe they don't process the world the way that you process the world. Maybe they don't see things the way that you see things, not because they're not able or because they can't, just maybe because they've never been shown who Jesus is. Maybe sometimes it's just us. We're looking into our world and we're looking at the way the world works and we're looking at all the things that go on around us and everything that's happening, and we just lose maybe for a moment, maybe for years, maybe for most of a lifetime, we lose our ability to process the world through a spiritual set of eyes. Maybe they call it a worldview. Maybe our worldview gets so out of whack that all of a sudden, we for some reason, we just can't seem to grasp the spiritual things of the world and how they impact us and what they mean and why they are so important. I love it when I go somewhere, and I think it was at the bank last time, and you ask somebody how they're doing. And what's something, y'all don't know how to answer this, but somebody will get it right. What's something in our culture that we say? When somebody says, "How you doing today?" Fine. Or we say, "I woke up." Anybody ever hear that? What did you say that, Jeff? I woke up this morning. I woke up on the right side. Anybody heard say that? What does that mean? I was on this side of the ground. I woke up this morning. I'm on this side of the ground. I'm looking at the right side of the daisies. Y'all ever hear anybody say that, or is it just my warped mind? Y'all heard that, right? What does that mean? Well, I'm alive. So the last time I think it was at the bank, said, "Well, I woke up, I can see the daisies." And I said, "You know what? I'm going to be just as good the day that I don't." Is that true? Is that true? It's absolutely true, isn't it? Because my life is not restricted to what happens in this body. But it's being able to see the world through a spiritual viewpoint, that my eyes are open to the reality of the world. Is our world perfect? No, it's far from perfect. Is there injustice and struggle in our world? Yes. Do we sit and ask our own questions like the disciples asking, "Well, why was this man born blind?" Do we sit down and ask sometimes, why does the world work the way the world works? Does anybody struggle with that? Yes. Can I answer it? Not totally, except I know everything is under God's hand. And I trust my God. Do you know a blind person? I don't mean physically blind, spiritually blind. Or in some ways, are you the blind person? That we're waiting for the moment where God, through Jesus, will just open your eyes so that you can see. The whole point of these lessons that we'll be doing is one. We are one body. Different backgrounds, different scenarios. We grew up in different places. We've struggled sometimes with different sins, maybe sometimes with the same ones. We're not perfect, or we wouldn't be here, because if we were perfect, there would no need for us to be here worshiping the Jesus who forgives our sin. And God takes every one of us with our frailties, with our problems, with our struggles, with our spiritual blindness, or whatever spiritual problem that we have, and He forgives us and He molds us and He makes us one incredible, loving body. And I want to tell you something about the church. The church in Jesus is perfect, but it's made up a lot of imperfect people. And I don't want to burst your bubble. God sees you as perfect. But as long as you are in this flesh, and as long as I am in this flesh, there is an imperfect part of us that we're going to make mistakes. We're going to do the wrong things sometimes. We're going to say the wrong things sometimes. We're going to interact with each other in an incorrect way sometimes. Sometimes we're going to hurt each other's feelings, even though we never probably intend to do that. And God takes that body with all of those talents, with all of those abilities, with all of the different gifts of the Spirit that He gives us, and He merges us into one incredible spiritual body to do His work. And it is absolutely amazing to me how God does that. And the question I have for you this morning is, are you part of that body? Have you let God open your eyes so that you can see what life is really all about? Do you confess the name of Jesus? Not just that you say it, but do you live it? Do you turn away from those things that are ungodly and run toward the things that are ungodly? Have you allowed Jesus to forgive your sin through the connection of death, burial, and resurrection through baptism? And do you honor God with everything that you do and every breath of your body and every act of your life? Because if you don't, you're missing the sight that Jesus has brought into our world. And if you need to respond, we're going to ask you to do that while we stand and sing.